prefer, it'll be projected. We've a story to tell is number 586, and Ye Servants of God is number 589. We'll sing the first and last stanza of both. Would you stand as we sing and as we worship? And 589. Number 589 is Ye Servants of God, the first and last again. Join us now for our fellowship and welcome time.
As you're making your way back to your seats, we will get started tonight and get your prayer concerns onto the prayer list. I have two to mention to you already. One that was given to me this morning is Wanda Fulbright. That is Marty's mom. I was given a note on it, and I want to make sure I give you the right information. But she broke her hip this week and is at College Pines, and Marty is asking us to be praying for her. So remember Wanda Fulbright and also Peggy Moore. She's doing good in her recovery. choosing a Bible translation. Tonight we'll be talking about the NASB. But as we get started, I would remind you, go ahead and look in your Bibles at Deuteronomy 6:5. That's one of the three comparison texts that we will be using in our study tonight. And you can flip to the others as we get there if you want to, but that'll be a good one to start with. And so, our whole reason for doing this series on choosing a Bible translation is not to run down a particular translation or to put a particular translation up on a pedestal and say that it is better than the rest, or that this one or these are trash, we shouldn't use them, or whatever the case may be. But what this series is all about is presenting the facts to you about the different Bible translations so that you can, as we look at these different translations, say, you know what, I've always used translation X here, but I won't just maybe try out translation Y or whatever it may be. And so the whole purpose of this is to help us make sure that we're using the translation that would fit us the best, or, as I said a couple of times, possibly to help us find the right one for our children or our grandchildren. And so tonight we're going to be talking about the New American Standard Bible. So how many people, I think I asked this last time, does anybody use the New American Standard Bible ever or use it regularly? 1, 2, okay. 3, all right. So we've got a few that use it. It's a version that I really like to use. I don't use it near as much as I probably should because I really do like that translation. And it's probably the first translation I read out of any type that I grew up using, because I grew up using the King James and the New King James. And then when I became a pastor and realized that, talking with some other pastors about the differences in translations and stuff, I'm pretty sure the NASB is the first one that I started reading. So I really like it, but, I don't use it near as much as I probably should. But it is a great translation that is used by many people. There's a lot that use it. And so we're going to dig into looking at it tonight. And so, as I said, it's titled the New American Standard Bible. And as far as the translation method, remember, we're going to go through and look at all of the same criteria for every Bible translation. And so the translation method for this particular one is word for word. As we've talked about, there's word for word and there's thought for thought, and then there's a blend of the two. The NIV is a blend of the thought for thought and word for word. The King James Version that we looked at last week is a word for word. The New American Standard is word for word, and it is very, very close to the word for word, and we'll explain a little bit of that a little bit later about just how true to the word for word that it is, coming from the Hebrew and coming from the Greek into English. As far as a reading level, last week we looked, I think the King James Version was at a 12th grade reading level. The NASB is at an 11th grade, so there's not much difference there. Again, you don't have to have made it to the 11th grade to be able to read this translation and understand it. It's just the general idea that is the reading level of that particular translation. Now, as far as the year that it was published and things like that, the original release date was 1971. That was when the New American Standard was released. The New Testament in that translation was released in 1963. And so it took them about 8 years to get the Old Testament ready for publication as opposed to the New Testament. Now, they did do some revisions in 1977, 1995, and 2020. For me, I don't like the 2020 translation or revision. I prefer the 95 version or revision, I guess I should say. And we'll talk a little bit about the differences in those revisions here in just a little bit. But for me, a lot of times the Bible software that I use gives you an option between 95 and 2020 or 2020, and I would just soon use the 95 myself, and I'm pretty sure Pastor Jake does too because of conversations we've had. But as far as translators go, there were 54 translators on this particular translation. If you remember last week, we were talking there were 47 for the King James Version back in 04 to 1611. Next week we'll see that there were more than 100 for the NIV. And so it doesn't mean more translators makes a better translation. It just means you have more translators putting eyes on the original text to help develop the translation. It's helpful for us to know that. Now, the sponsor for the New American Standard Bible is a group called the Lockman Foundation. And the Lockman Foundation is a group that produces Christian resources that go out across the globe. But their primary or most notable works are the NASB and another Bible that I'm sure some of you may have used called the Amplified Bible. Has anybody ever used the Amplified Bible? We got a few of those as well. And so the Amplified Bible is a translation that is provided through the Lockman Foundation as well. And so what you'll see going forward is that rather than with like the King James Version where the sponsor was King James himself, what you'll find is that a lot of times the translations that are post 1800, those translations are done by societies and foundations, Bible societies and different groups like that. It's a group of people, not just one person saying, I've got the money and we're going to make this happen. It's a group of people that pull together to make this translation happen. And so the important thing for us is, as we've talked about each time, is where do they draw their translation from? What Old Testament manuscripts, what New Testament manuscripts are they using, and things like that. And so, and are they leaning on a previous English version of the Bible to help fill in the gaps in places and to help aid in translation? Because remember last time the King James Version used the Bishop's Bible and the Geneva Bible and another Bible I can't remember right offhand, but they used the English translations that had already been done before the KJV to help aid in their translation. Well, the New American Standard Version did the same thing. With them, the English text that they drew from, used, is called the American Standard Version. And I know this is a loaded question because I already know one person that uses it, but does anybody use the ASV? I know Herb does. And I had never been familiar with it till Herb and I were talking about the translation that he preferred, which is he likes the ASV. And so we were talking about it, and I started looking at it some. And so it's kind of interesting. It's not one that we're going to look at in our series just because of popularity's sake. But if you've got questions about it, Herb really likes it. And so Herb could answer a question or two. But the interesting thing about the New American Standard Bible is that they used the ASV as their English text, and basically were trying to make an updated modern version in English of the biblical text, but they were strongly influenced by the ASV. As far as the Old Testament text that they used Biblia Hebraica, which is a Latin term for Hebrew Bible, but they used Biblia Hebraica, which was a third edition from 1937. So when I say that, what it means is that this guy, Rudolph Kittel, wrote the Biblia Hebraica. And so he had various editions of it. He would update it and get more editions and get more sales because he wrote more books and that sort of thing. But the Biblia Hebraica is a particular thing called a critical text. I've got to mention one in the Greek text here in just a minute, and then I'm going to explain what a critical text is to help us sort of understand this. But they also use the Dead Sea Scrolls, because the Dead Sea Scrolls are dated back to like the 1st or 2nd century BC, and they're not completely intact as far as like a complete text of the entire Bible, but there is enough for translators to view the Dead Sea Scrolls, and there are several new or more modern translations that use the Dead Sea Scrolls as a manuscript for reference because there is very little difference in the Hebrew from the time of the Dead Sea Scrolls to hundreds of years later when the manuscripts had been translated over and over, or copied over and over and over. So there's not a lot of difference there. There's very little difference. And that's important because that shows us the integrity of the copying and the reproductions that go along there. Something interesting else to think about too is the Dead Sea Scrolls are a prime example of Old Testament or ancient manuscripts that were found post 1611. So what that means to us is that being able to use more manuscripts, because there have obviously been a lot more manuscripts found since 1611 than what they had available to them in 1611 to do the King James Version. It means that there is a greater understanding now of how to translate the Bible than we had back then. And so that's one of the good things of us being able to look at things like the Dead Sea Scrolls and other manuscripts that have been found in the last 400 years. And so that helps us to have a better understanding of the Greek and Hebrew language, which translates to a better understanding of what the biblical writers were trying to share with us, which is what we need anyway. The next thing is the New Testament text. And you see a big long word there, Nestle Allen's Novum Testamentum Gracia, which is basically the Greek New Testament that was written or collaborated on by a guy named Nestle and a guy named Allen. And not Nestle, the chocolate guy, in case you're wondering. But nevertheless, they put together this this Greek New Testament, and this is for the NASB they used the 26th edition. So there were a lot of editions, a lot of updates as they found more manuscripts. They went back and revised their editions, and so that was what it was. Now, the interesting thing is that we talked about last time was the difference between the Byzantine and the Alexandrian text. The Byzantine were older, the Byzantine manuscripts were newer, as in 9th century to 16th century, and that's what they used for the King James Version. The Alexandrian texts are older, meaning they're closer to the original source, and they were from about 175, 200 AD to about 900, 1000 AD. And so they're older, they're closer to the original text, and so they may be a little bit more choppy in the way that they're written and not as refined as the Byzantine, but for the New American Standard, what it means for us is they use the Alexandrian text that we talked about last time. So as far as these critical texts, the Nestle Allen book, the New Testament, Greek New Testament that they produced, and that Biblia Hebraica, those are what are called critical text. And basically what that means is they're critical editions of their respective languages, a Hebrew and a Greek text. And this is an explanation. It's the best way I know to sort of explain it. It says if a scholar has several versions of a manuscript, meaning they have several versions of the manuscript for Daniel, in this manuscript, one's from 400 AD, one's from 200 AD, one's from 500 AD. They've got several manuscripts of Daniel. Okay, let's just look at it that way. But they do not have the original, because we don't have the original one that Daniel signed and, handed off. So what they do is they use established methods of textual criticism. I mean, they criticize the text. They look over the text. They study the text. What kind of grammar is used? What kind of syntax is used? And things like that. And then they do that so it can be used to seek to reconstruct the original text as closely as possible. So if you've got 4 versions of the book of Daniel and you're like, okay, well, what's the differences? Well, they notice that that this one has a phrase that's only in this other one, but it's not in the other 2 or 3. Then they're like, well, maybe that's right. Let's build a portrait by sort of layering the manuscripts. They sort of look at all the manuscripts and see what the original would have probably have been. When we look at that Greek New Testament and that Hebrew Bible that was written, that was used as the text basis for the New American Standard Bible, that's what they've done. That's what those translators did when they wrote 3 editions or 26 editions, what they did was they went and took every copy of Daniel that they could find, every copy of the book of Matthew or whatever it was, and then they tried their best to sort of paint a picture of what the original would have looked like from what sources they had to work with. And so that's what we see a lot of times is that the ones that they used were primarily the Alexandrian manuscripts. And so going forward, we'll see some of these names again. I know we will next week with the NIV and probably with other translations that we'll look at. So that's what the critical text that they wrote is all about. It's basically taking multiple copies of the manuscripts that they have of a particular book of the Bible and then being very critical of it, very critical of the grammar, the syntax, all that is used, and trying to paint a picture of what the original text would have looked like based on the variants and things like that in the text. Now, we're talking about these translations, and as always, we want to know, well, what was the reason? What was the purpose for why they had this translation done? And with the NASB, they produced it to meet the need for a literal modern translation of the English Bible. And so what they wanted was something that was a literal translation, as close as they could get it. There are certain things, as I've told you before, that in Greek or Hebrew, because they are completely different languages, it doesn't translate into the English because the English is such a weird language anyway. But there are certain ideas and certain things that are implied just by the use of a word in all 3 of those languages that may not translate to the others. And so what they tried to do was do as closely as they could a literal translation of the Bible from the original languages in modern English, basically not in 17th century King's English, so to speak. And so they removed antiquated phrases and words. Not that they removed words from the Bible, they removed the type of language used in older translations like the ASV and even back into the King James Version. And the Revised Standard Version was one that they were trying to. The Revised Standard Version was before the ASV and then the NASB, but they were trying to remove some of those antiquated phrases. And so they were just trying to, and they also added modern punctuation, commas, periods, and things like that are not in Greek because Greek does not punctuate like English does. I told you before that one scripture in one of Paul's writings, like the entire chapter, it seems like, is one run-on sentence, or what we would refer to as a run-on sentence. And so when you look at it, there is no punctuation. I mean, it would be, it's just like you read the Bible without stopping for the periods. And I mean, that's the way Paul wrote that particular section. And Greek is okay with that. English, you'd get a big red F with a big circle in red, from your teacher if you wrote something like that. Not that your pastor ever had those, but English was definitely not my strong suit because I speak Southern American. But nevertheless, we want to know too some of the interesting facts about the New American Standard Bible. And one of those has to do with the use of the word Lord or God and Yahweh in the New American Standard Version. So the ASV, which they leaned very heavily on, translated the Hebrew word that is spelled in English YHWH, which we pronounce as Yahweh, or transliterate as Yahweh. The ASV translated Yahweh as Jehovah. That's very common. That's not unheard of. And you maybe remember that the reason they call it Jehovah rather than Yahweh is to keep from breaking the 10 Commandments or the commandment about using the Lord's name in vain. That's what the Jews originally did. They developed the term Jehovah to keep from saying Yahweh so that they didn't break the commandment. And so the ASV followed suit with them. So what they did was they translated Yahweh as Jehovah, when most English translations would normally translate it as Lord or God. That's what you normally see in most translations, is that they don't translate it as Jehovah and follow the Jewish pattern. They do what most English translations do. They call it Lord or God. And they'll put those in capital letters when they do that. But the translators of the ASV said that the American revisers were brought to the unanimous conviction that a Jewish superstition, talking about the breaking of the Ten Commandments, which regarded the divine name as too sacred to be uttered, ought no longer to dominate in the English or any other any other version of the Old Testament. And so what we see is that that now what they do is they translate it as Lord or God. And the NASB, which did lean heavily on the ASV, does that very thing. They translate it as Lord or God. Now, if you go, and does anybody use the Legacy Standard Bible, LSB? Anybody use that? Pastor Jake uses it. He likes it. It is basically a 2021 version of the NASB. That was, it's basically the same thing as the NASB, and it was produced by John MacArthur and the Masters Seminary. And so the thing they did was they went back and started using Jehovah instead of Lord and God in the Bible, in that particular translation. So it's one of those things. Do you stick with the way that the Jews did and their concern for breaking the commandment on using the Lord's name in vain, or even taking a chance on it, or do you just use Lord or God, which a lot of times is translated Adonai anyway? But that's one of the interesting things that comes along with this translation. One other thing is that the translation committee, the translators for this, came from a ton of different denominations and religious groups. It came from very many, from higher learning institutions for denominations all over the place. So here's the list. I think I've got it for you to see on the screen. There's Presbyterian, Methodist, Southern Baptist, Church of Christ, Nazarene, American Baptist, Fundamentalist, Conservative Baptist, Free Methodist, as opposed to imprisoned Methodist. Free Methodist, Congregational, Disciples of Christ, Evangelical, Free, Independent Baptist, Independent Mennonite, Assembly of God, North American Baptist, and as they say, other religious groups. And so when it came to getting these 54 translators together, they didn't just go and get a whole bunch of Southern Baptist or a whole bunch of Methodist or a whole bunch of Presbyterian translators from those seminaries, these people who I've heard of preachers that do this, and it blows my mind, that could stand in the pulpit and read from the Greek text in English to you because they are that fluent in Koine Greek. I can barely remember my social security number, okay? So I'm not going to be doing the whole, reading from Greek and translating it to English as I speak to you type thing. But there are people who can do that, and those are the types of translators that they would go to the Methodist or Presbyterian seminaries who are teaching how to translate Greek and Hebrew. They would get them, and they would come, and so they have them all coming together from a lot of different backgrounds, a lot of different denominational views, and they're coming together to translate these. And so there were a lot of translators from a lot of different backgrounds that helped put together the New American Standard Bible. The third interesting thing when it came to the actual translation work, is that if there was a literal definition of an expression that was unclear for modern readers, a current modern expression or idiom was used with an explanation in the footnotes. And so if there was a phrase in the Greek or a phrase in the Hebrew that just does not translate well into English, which I am not surprised, because having taken Greek and Hebrew, it'll blow your mind. Trying to figure out what are they trying to say, because you have to first off worry about grammar in English, but then you got to worry about grammar in this dead language that nobody speaks now or even uses. And so what they did was they took those places where there were sayings or things that just those expressions did not mesh well with the English, or would have just not made sense, or would have messed with the sentence structure and just did not work. What they would do is they would use a modern idiom, a modern expression in there, but then they would put it in the footnotes, an explanation as to why they used that. I don't know how many times that happened. I wish I had looked that up so that we just sort of have that number, but that's one of the interesting things that they did. As far as the comparing the verses, you have Deuteronomy 6:5, which I've told you last time is a part of the Shema that the Jews recited and read. And before, last time we had the King James Version as one of our translations the translation we were looking at, so we didn't have to develop new slides for this. But going forward, after we get past the NIV, to look at the ESV and the NLT and others, we'll have to have some more slides here. But you see that this part of the Shema, you see the way that it is phrased. And an interesting thing that I do remember from my Hebrew class is that when you read those sentences in the Bible and it says "and," we think it's really kind of weird to start a sentence with the word "and," right? I mean, that ain't good English, right? And so the interesting thing about it is that's how the sentence is actually written in the Hebrew. They start it with "and." And so that's not just a weird translation into the English. That's literally how it's written. And so when you have one that, like the NIV, which is a blend of the word for word and the thought for thought, they went more with the modern English view of grammar and syntax, and so they left the "and" off. But that word, if I'm not mistaken, most likely is there in the original Hebrew. So you see that there's not a lot of difference there. The NASB looks very much like, to some degree, the NIV. As opposed to the KJV, it just looks like an updated, like we said. They wanted to update it into modern English and get rid of some of the archaic phrases and usage that are there and put in modern punctuation. So you see that there's a lot that's very similar there. And you can even compare it if you use a different translation than one of these three. You can see it the difference there between that and your Bible. The next verse that we have is John 3:16. And so this, again, is all three of them. Again, you see that there is a lot of similarities between the NIV and the New American Standard Bible. Ironically, the NIV is newer than the New American Standard Bible and has worse punctuation, if you look at it that way. If you take the NASB as having the correct punctuation. But you see that it is almost word for word very similar to the NIV, where the idea of what is in the King James Version is still very close with the other two, but again, you have the more archaic, more 17th century language there. But we talked about the differences there between eternal life and everlasting life. It's not that a different idea is being shared there. It's just a different terminology. Semantics, if you want to call it that way. And then the last one that we have is Romans 12:1. And so here is the King James Version against the NASB. One of the things that they also did with the NASB translation is you notice there that both of them start off basically saying, "I urge or beseech you, brothers or brethren," and then the NASB puts in brackets, "and sisters." That is something they did in the NASB to make it, I don't want to use that phrase because that sounds bad. I want to say inclusive, but that's not in the modern context of inclusive. What I'm trying to say is that they're trying to make it less gender specific. I don't know if that's do you understand what I'm saying? Maybe more universal, rather that, because the way that the word brothers is in the original Greek, it's believers, it's brothers, it's brethren, it's that sort of thing. But what they're trying to get at is that it's not just talking to the men in the church. Does that make sense? And so the NASB tried to fix that by in places where this needed to be, they bracketed it off and did it a little differently. And so thank you for understanding that your pastor is an idiot and does not know how to use modern English to explain his ideas. And thank you for the group help on all of this. The other one you have is the NIV, and you'll see that there is, again, some differences in the punctuation. And the NIV didn't even bracket the and sisters, but it's all in. And see, this is the difference that the translators take. This is a great example of this for you, for us to be able to see. When you look at this, you look at the way that the sentences are structured. That's all in relation to how the translators view the original text and trying to make it sound readable in modern English. So they both say, "Therefore I urge you, brothers and sisters." And they say, "by the mercies of God" in the NASB, but they say, "in view of God's mercy." We're still talking about what? The mercy of God and the way we're viewing it as brothers and sisters in Christ. And then it goes on, it says, in the NASB, it says, "to present your bodies as a living and holy sacrifice." And then up there it says, "to offer your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God." And so what we see is that it's the semantics, it's the way that the translators look at it and say, okay, this is the way the sentence should be phrased. If you've ever used the software program Grammarly, does anybody use that for... Oh my goodness, it is the greatest thing ever. If you don't use it and you speak like a hick from Caldwell County like I do, then by all means, download it and use it on your computer, because I sound a lot better because of Grammarly when I stand up in the pulpit on Sundays mornings. But what it does is it comes and it tells me, it says, "Pastor Nick, this big red underline means that you sound like a hick from Caldwell County instead of like a normal human being from North Carolina." And so what it does is it changes the sentence structure sometimes for me, and I'm like, oh, that does sound better. Wow, I can't believe I sounded so stupid at times. And but that's what it does. The translators for the Greek and Hebrew had to do the same thing. They had to figure out, without Grammarly, they had to figure out, how does this sound in English? What's the best way, taking what we see in the original language and what we're trying to put into English, what is the best syntax, sentence structure that would work best with the grammar that we're working with and all of that. And so it is a great example there of a few of those things. I think that's the last of the comparing verses, correct, Billy? Okay. So the last thing we're going to wrap up with are the pros and cons of the New American Standard Bible. We're going to start looking at the pros. One is its use in Bible study. I read a couple of places that put it this way, that it is used by adults for serious Bible study. Not that meaning if you use a different translation, you're not serious about studying the Bible, okay? But for adults, maybe not so much for children, but for adults, it will be one that some adults will use for their serious Bible study rather than just their daily reading Bible, that sort of thing. And, a lot of different texts, a lot of different translations have great use for serious Bible study. Another is the faithfulness to the original text, meaning the faithfulness to the Greek, the faithfulness to the Hebrew. And it's widely considered as one of the most accurate and reliable translations that is out there, that you can find, that you can buy, you can download, hold in your hands in some digital format or hardback cover or whatever, or hard version. It is considered most accurate and most reliable when it comes to the fact that they have tried to stay so true to the original text. That is key when we want a translation, knowing what God inspired the authors to originally write as best we can get to, using 15 copies of the book of Daniel, trying to figure out what Daniel actually wrote. But as we'll see in a few moments, that also is a con for the NASB. One of the cons for the NASB, though, is difficulty in comprehension. And that is because with it being a more literal interpretation of the original text, then what that means is that sentences and phrases can sometimes be hard to understand, or what's really trying to be portrayed here in the text. You heard me talk 2 weeks ago, or whenever it was, I mentioned it to you before. This is the translation that I told you was very choppy, that you'll be reading in it. It seems sort of disjointed at times. Pastor Jake said he had heard it phrased as woody, that it was very rigid, it was very hard. At times the comprehension is a little difficult. Well, when you try to stay so true to the original text in an ancient language and bring it into a modern English translation, you're going to have that happen because there is such difference between ancient Hebrew and Koine Greek and modern English. Regardless of whether it's 17th century or 20th century or 21st century English, it's going to have that choppy wooden appearance if you try and stay away from I want to make it easy to read for everybody, and it's just going to sound good, rather going to the literal translation as they've done, as much as they can. The other con is the language used, and that's sort of the same thing. One of the cons is that some of the phrases and some of the sentence structure can make it difficult to read for understanding and context. Not just reading it to be reading, but sometimes in places it can be hard to read it for understanding and even to understand the greater context of what is being shared there. And so those are the pros and cons of the New American Standard Bible. And as I said, we will try and present those every time with every translation as best we can. And so before I take questions, basically that's the end of our study tonight. And next week we will look at the best-selling version of the Bible in modern history, and that is the New International Version, the NIV. It is the best-selling Bible currently. I think maybe ever. There's like 450 million copies of it in print. So are there any questions or comments about the NASB? No, they speak modern Greek. They don't speak Koine Greek. Koine Greek probably went out of being used. It's the same one that was spread by Alexander the Great in like 300 BC. And so when you talk about Greek culture and the Hellenistic Jews and the Hellenistic culture, that's the Koine Greek that was